Hello and good evening to the world today. My guest is Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus in International Law at Princeton, UN reporter on human rights, author of various books on law, politics, Palestine, Israel, who has been in the eye of the storm recently when the decision was taken by the United States and implemented by a servile UN Secretary General, Guterres, formerly a Portuguese Prime Minister, to disallow the report on the situation in Palestine to be posted on the UN website. This was an official report commissioned by the UN's Social and Economic Commission on West Asia, when Guterres said that the report could not be published or distributed by any UN body. The chair of this commission, Rima Khalaf, refused. She was pressured to take it off. She chose not to do so and instead resigned. As a result, this whole question has been reverberating throughout the world. Richard Falk is in Britain to discuss and promote his new book, Palestine's Horizon Towards a Just Peace, and he was not allowed to speak at two English universities over the last few days, the University of Middlesex and the University of East London barred him from speaking as part of the new Israeli offensive together with the EU to stop so-called anti-Semitism being encouraged by universities. This has never happened to Richard in the United States, not so far, and not even under Trump. Richard, very good to have you with us. Especially on Telesur, which, as you know, is broadcast from Venezuela and Quito in Ecuador, two of the countries which broke off diplomatic relations with Israel after the assault on Gaza were Venezuela and Bolivia, so there's a great deal of interest there. Let us start by saying, what did they dislike about the report?
Well, I think it was essentially the focus on apartheid as a way of describing the overall manner in which Israel has come to dominate the Palestinian people based on structures of systematic discrimination. And the report is really an academic study. It is not a polemical document. It was reviewed by three eminent international law jurists that were anonymous when they were asked to review it from different parts of the world. They were very positive about its contribution as a scholarly analysis. And we understood that the conclusion, although we felt it was well based on legal analysis and on the facts, would be controversial, and our hope was that it would open a reasoned debate on something that needs to be discussed. After 50 years of occupation, it's not descriptive of the reality, and it really trivializes the suffering of the Palestinian people. And we feel that this new language of apartheid does represent a shift in placing the emphasis on a structure that affects the Palestinian people as a whole, and not just those living in the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, but also those living in refugee camps, those subject to involuntary exile, and those living as a discriminated minority in Israel itself.
To this, the Israelis would reply that the right to return is a utopia. There are too many Palestinians now living abroad, and to grant them the right of return would reduce the Jewish segment of the population of Israel-Palestine to a minority. To the charge of apartheid, they can't reply, so they say this is anti-Semitic slander. And the third response they have always had till now, though it's beginning to look more and more thin, is that we are the only democracy in the Middle East. Look, the Palestinians have their party, they have members of the Knesset, etc., etc. How would you respond to that?
Well, each of those arguments, I think, are quite weak in the present context. It's true that the Palestinian minority in Israel has the constitutional status of being citizens of Israel, entitled to vote and form a political party. But Israel has, from the beginning, adopted a rather, what should I say, indirect way of implementing what amounts to racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination. It's often called an ethnocracy because of this. And it uses the device of discriminating through nationality laws rather than through citizenship status. And there must be somewhere in the order of 50 laws that affect land acquisition, residency, return if you depart from Israel, family unification, whole series of ways that the Palestinian minority is suppressed. And one of the restrictions is if they advocate the formation of a secular state rather than a Jewish state, that's considered a violation of law, I believe punishable as a crime. It's always been a kind of convenient political fiction to accept this notion, a sort of cosmetic democracy that underneath involves a dual system of control and restriction. As far as the argument about the right of return is concerned, which is an important argument, the Palestinians have never done more than to insist that the symbolic right, which is embedded in international law, has been reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly on several occasions, that right be recognized, and then some kind of plausible and practical mechanism be adopted to implement it. Most of the Palestinians around the world wouldn't want to exercise that right, but they don't want to be denied the right. Israel continues to grant Jews, whatever their connection or lack of connection with Israel, there's no restriction. Any Jew anywhere in the world, whether religious or not, or whether having relatives or not in Israel, has an unconditional right to return, whereas Palestinians whose families have lived for generations within what's now Israel are denied that any right to return.
Richard, the response of US governments to the continued deterioration of the everyday life of the Palestinians in Israel, outside Israel, wherever, has been quite shocking. In fact, if you think back, the last administration that rapped them on the knuckles quite severely was Bush 1.
Yes.
They were quite sharp with them. And I think the Secretary of State then threatened that if you carry on like this, don't take your subsidies from us for granted. Yeah. But subsequently, Bush 2, Clinton, Obama, and now Trump have followed the same path.
Yes, and the US Congress, of course, is
Given them a blank check.
Yes, blank check, and it's a bipartisan blank check. It's not an issue that divides Republicans and Democrats. And Obama, who's so criticized and attacked by the Netanyahu leadership and by Israeli public opinion, went out of his way to do everything
they wanted.
Yes, absolutely everything they wanted, including a really obscene increase in military assistance. It's already by far the most militarized country in the region with the most sophisticated weaponry, and it's prosperous enough to support its own military. It's just a symbol of the degree to which the U.S. is prepared to support Israel no matter what it does.
The trouble you ran into with Obama's representatives at the UN, Samantha Power and Susan Rice, was the same as what's going on now. And this is Samantha Power, who for years used to parade herself as a great defender of human rights. We have to go to war to defend human rights, a great warmonger of humanitarian interventions, except in Israel-Palestine. There her humanitarian views come to an end. Given her previous argument, she would insist on a US intervention in Israel.
No question about it. But she had actually made sort of positive statements about the Palestinians in the past. I think her case is one of pure opportunism. It's unfortunate. I mean, she was, as you say, a kind of humanitarian interventionist in the past.
But Richard, how do you explain this Israeli obsession? Right or wrong, whatever they do gets US support automatically, both from Congress and usually, with rare exceptions, from the White House. Now, Walt and Mearsheimer argued that there was an active Israeli lobby, which is true. We know it's called AIPAC. It does what it does. It's hardly a secret. Michael Massing, if my memory is correct, wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books saying that what they missed out was the exact amount of money which is paid by AIPAC to both Democrats and Republicans. So there's the sort of cash nexus. The question which has always puzzled me is that this is the world's largest empire and the only real empire that still exists. Is it in their imperial interests to be so totally committed to one country? A, and B, can you conceive of any circumstances in which they might just break and say enough is enough?
Well, Tariq, you raised several issues in this. The U.S. is not so much a global empire as it is a global state, particularly its military power and all the oceans with almost 1,000 foreign bases. But it's not an empire in the conventional sense because it doesn't want to fly its flag and
no, it's a different sort of domination compared to the European powers. Its domination is pretty astonishing, which is why I ask, what about Israel? What explains it?
Within this set of issues that you talked about by referencing AIPAC and the people that try to explain why it's so influential, for me, the real answer to this really unprecedented capacity to control the U.S. government is the absence of countervailing power. There's no incentive given to any elected official to take a position of principle, and there is the disincentive that they know if they stand apart on this issue, they will be opposed by this lobby that has great resources at its capacity. A few people have over the years tried to do that and they've been punished. So there's a kind of disciplinary domestic system there, and it's this failure of the Palestinians to create some degree of countervailing force it has they've paid a very high price for that.
Richard, just, without sounding too cynical, if money is the only problem, I mean, the oil wealth of the Arab world and many Palestinian individual billionaires, I mean, I often ask them once or twice in public, can't you buy at least 3 or 4 senators and about 10 or 15 congressmen? Give them what they want. The Israelis do it. Buy them.
No, but you fail to appreciate the degree to which Jews are entrenched in the main cities in the United States, in the media industry, and they have a domestic influence that extends beyond AIPAC, and therefore it's a unique phenomenon. It's also been done with a considerable sophistication in how you mobilize public opinion and media, corporatized media in the U.S. It's a complicated thing. The other factor is an external factor, that goes to this issue of rationality of imperial foreign policy. And that, I think, changed with the 1967 war, because I think then Israel demonstrated that it was no longer a strategic burden for the U.S. There used to be a kind of split between the Arabists in the State Department who were worried about the oil diplomacy and the people that were reflecting the concern with the aftermath of the Holocaust and other kinds of more softer issues. But after '67, there was this feeling that Israel was a strategic asset in the region. After the Iranian Revolution in '79, it became an important way of maintaining Western interests in the Middle East, which were under this now dual pressure. And so it isn't as irrational as it seems. And then Israel has done its own part by developing these arms sales relations with over 100 countries. One of the reasons they don't get as much diplomatic pushback as one would expect is because they've been giving counterinsurgency training to governments throughout Asia
and South America.
And South America and Africa. And they've been very effective in pushing this kind of arms diplomacy.
Can you think even of any circumstances which might compel the US to break? If they nuked Iran or if they did something completely crazy?
I'm not sure I have the moral or political imagination to project a scenario which would be so shocking that it would produce this kind of reaction. With Trump as president, he's such an unpredictable political figure that he could imagine himself having a kind of historic legacy if he strikes a deal. He's a deal maker, not a normal presidential leader. So you could see him look at what Nixon did in China and say, maybe I should, maybe I could do this. I might lose my son-in-law in the process, but it's a small price to pay. I mean, he did make this sort of careless statement at the press conference.
One state, two states. What does it matter?
What does it matter? If the parties agree, it's okay with us. It was...
Coming to that question, Richard, in your latest book, which I liked very much, Palestine's Horizon Towards a Just Peace, effectively you describe the situation which has developed after the Oslo Accords, and you pay warm tributes to Edward Said, the late Palestinian intellectual, who from the beginning said that Oslo is like the Treaty of Versailles. For the Germans, it's the Treaty of Versailles. For the Palestinians, it's a huge defeat, and he was denounced from all sides. But now it's crystal clear that that's what it was. So
he was very prophetic in
very,
that way.
Very prescient.
He was a close friend, and I talked to him just at the time of the Oslo deployment. And I thought he was, I thought he should give Oslo a chance. We actually disagreed, but he, of course, was completely right. Yes.
Yeah. So where are we now, Richard? We have a sort of extreme right-wing government running Israel. We have Israeli dissidents themselves under heavy attack. We have the collaboration of the EU with the Israelis, which are preventing dissident views from being aired. It's as if the world is just blind to Palestinian suffering, because no one is thinking of any real solution. I mean, I was convinced for a long time now that the only solution was a unitary state, a democratic unitary state. And I think the Palestinians would accept it, whatever they might say in public. The real problem is that the Zionist hierarchy is completely opposed to that. I mean, I once debated a Likud MP, and he said, well, we're the only Jewish state in the world. And whereas the Palestinians have lots of states, Arab states.
That's a standard
answer. Yeah. But what the dangerous side of this is that this is now identifying a Jew with a Zionist. The only good Jews are those who are Zionists. And if you're not a Zionist Jew, then either you're self-hating or you're acting on behalf of someone else's interests. And it's a similar argument that is used by Islamic fundamentalist groups and terrorist groups who say the same thing. We're the only ones defending Islam, and those Muslims who don't agree with us are not real Muslims at all. So you have a mirror image of these two things going on.
As a Jew myself, I've struggled with this issue and have been accused of all kinds of things. And if one looks at the history of the Zionist movement, it was obviously a political project of some Jews in Europe and was always opposed by prominent Jews. But Zionism over the years and with the moral force that the Holocaust provided for...
That was crucial.
Yes, that was crucial to the formation of Israel. There's now a prime minister here that wants to celebrate the Balfour Declaration of 100 years ago, which is an incredible regression to the colonial mentality, really, astonishing. One would have thought that even a conservative British leader would want to forget that gesture that would completely ignore...
The only Jewish member of that English cabinet voted against the Balfour Declaration.
Montague, yes.
Montague, yeah.
Yes.
Because he saw how it would be used.
Yes.
And he also saw it as a gentle kick to the Jews. We're giving you your own state, why don't you go there?
See, increasingly, supporters of Israel have tried to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And some of the reactionary political leaders have gone along with that. There's now this definition here of anti-Semitism, which makes criticism of Israel the potential subject of anti-Semitism.
But Richard, you know, this is so dangerous. This sort of attitude is actually encouraging.
No, I completely... yes, genuine anti-Semitism,
yes.
which is a way of blaming Jews as a people for the suffering of the Palestinians, rather than Zionism as a movement or Israel as a state among states as responsible for these policies and practices that have imposed extraordinary suffering. And as you said earlier, Tarek, the tendency of the US government, particularly in the short period of the Trump presidency, is to completely erase the Palestinians as a presence. It's just a matter of how you support Israel and rendering the Palestinians almost invisible in the process. And that's the worst kind of abuse of a victimized people, is to not even acknowledge their victimization.
Richard, as someone who's followed this question for a long, long time, you know it obviously much better than me, but I do feel the situation is the worst it's been for a long time. Despite the 48, despite 67, there was still always hope that something could be achieved. At the moment, it's not just on the issue of Palestine, but as we know on many other issues, it's a sort of strange, spooky atmosphere. So many Palestinians I've spoken to are incredibly depressed, saying our leaders have betrayed us, they've collaborated with the IDF, there's no hope anymore. And a lot of them are becoming depoliticized and demoralized as a result.
No, it's a real crisis of moral and political consciousness for the Palestinians themselves. I do think the global solidarity movement
has been very important.
It's
the best thing.
And it's growing, and and there is a real successful, what I call legitimacy war, that has been waged for the past decade or so, that has established the authenticity of what the Palestinians are seeking, that is influencing international public opinion. And if you look at the outcome of the conflicts since 1945, they've almost all been eventually won by the side that controls the moral and political discourse, not by the side that has the hard power. I mean, all the anti-colonial wars were won by the weaker side militarily.
Ultimately,
and the U.S. in Vietnam should have learned that lesson. It had absolute control over air, sea, and land, and yet it lost the war. And it keeps trying to reinvent
the reasons for losing the war.
Yes, so that it can do it again and lose again. And that happens in Afghanistan, Iraq, and invests huge amounts of resources in this failing mission. But I think the lesson underneath all this is that military power doesn't have the historical agency that it had in the 19th century and in the first part of the 20th century.
That's why the Israelis are finding it very difficult to deal with the solidarity movement in BDS. They are worried.
Yes. No, they're very worried. They're much more worried about that than armed resistance.
Yes.
They see that correctly as the biggest threat to their project, to the completion of their project. And their project is not one of normal national self-determination. It's a kind of biblically
Eretz
Israel. Yes, and they talk of the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, and never use the international language, which signifies that the Zionist project is not yet complete until there's been that formal annexation. And so there is a kind of one-state scenario that is, I think, that is embodied in the Zionist project, which has always expanded beyond what it previously seemed to be aiming for. Starting with the Balfour Declaration, which promised a homeland, then with the British Mandate coming with a partition. They never wanted partition, and they tried to undermine it from the beginning. And so one has this moving target, in effect. And they've been very clever and sophisticated in fooling a lot of people in the West, partly because there was such a reluctance to criticize a Jewish movement.
Of the Judeo-side.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Richard, on that note, we must bring this conversation to an end. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been great having you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been a long admirer, and so it's a good
Thanks.
I welcome this opportunity to have a conversation.
Thank you.